Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Billions of dollars are spent each year on foreign aid and global development. In the past, the exact amount of aid that is being spent, where it is being spent, by whom it is being spent, and to what end the aid is serving has been very difficult for outsiders to parse. But that has been changing in recent years. Aid agencies in government and multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations are becoming increasingly transparent. And that's not least because they have been spurred to do so by my guest today, Gary Forster. He is the executive director of Publish What You Fund, the global campaign for aid and development transparency. The organization publishes an annual index of 47 aid agencies from the public sector and private philanthropy, which assess how open each entity is in regards to its operations and disbursements. In our conversation, Gary Forster explains why transparency in aid is so important, and he identifies some of the entities that rank highest and lowest on the Aid Transparency Index. The data compiled by Publish What You Fund also offers a very good bird's-eye view of aid and development spending, so we spend a good bit of time in this conversation discussing some of the broad trends that he has seen in recent years among donors. And this includes the impact of COVID-19 on foreign aid and development assistance. The increasing willingness of aid agencies to open up their books to outside scrutiny has been a very important trend in recent years, and I was glad to speak with Gary Forster about the implications of a movement towards greater aid transparency. Also, at the end of this conversation, we discuss the implications of the British government's decision to combine their aid and development portfolios under one new umbrella. And that's very significant because the UK's Department for International Development is widely regarded as one of the most effective aid organizations, and there are questions over whether or not combining the UK's aid and development portfolios might undermine the efficacy of DFID. I should say, despite the subject matter, this conversation is accessible to a broader foreign policy audience, which is ultimately, my goal with a lot of these kinds of conversations and episodes. So thank you. All right, here is my conversation with Gary Forster of Publish What You Fund.
So I think for a long time now, there's been a recognition that if we want to have true accountability of aid, and that means in terms of the citizens in the countries that are providing it, as well as the citizens who live in the countries that are receiving it, if we want to understand the efficiency of aid in terms of the economic return on what we're investing and the impact that that's making, that we need to have access to a whole bunch of data and information about aid itself. And that includes transparency around the processes that aid goes through. So how it is, how decisions are made about how it's prioritized, how, for example, procurement of aid is done when INGOs or private contractors are bidding for work to undertake aid projects. But also then the detail of, where is the project taking place? What sector is it in? How much is it worth? When are the disbursements, the individual sort of tranches of cash being dispersed to the contractor? What were the original objectives of that aid? And then, are there evaluations available that show us what the actual impact of an initiative is? And I think that aid transparency as a concept, it encompasses all of that information that one might want in order to evaluate the efficacy of aid. So a good example of where donors are trying to be transparent to, say, citizens or stakeholders in their own countries would be the British government, the UK Aid Dev Tracker portal, which provides a really granular insight into the activities of UK aid as it is dispersed through international non-governmental organizations, or through multilateral agencies, or through development finance institutions, or through the UN, for example. Now, their platform is as a portal. It's branded as UK Aid and so on. But it is drawing data from a data set that has been written in a coded language called Ayati, which is the International Aid Transparency Initiative Standard. So back in,
I'm going to say we're going to get into acronyms. If you're ever talking about aid and development, we'll go deep into the acronyms. But thank you for defining that.
Yeah, sure. So Ayati was born as a language for aid transparency to be communicated. Ayati was born back in 2008 when at the Accra meetings, it was initially promoted by DFID and a whole bunch of other stakeholders that we needed a single language in which to communicate aid and development activity, a language that could be, would allow us to compare different activities undertaken by different governments and different donor agencies and different NGOs. And that's how we ended up with the Ayati Standard. And we currently have more than 1,000 organizations globally, including most of the major donors and development banks and so forth, and most of the major INGOs. We have them publishing data in this language to what is called the Ayati Registry. And the Dev Tracker portal that I was just referring to sort of uses that same data. So DFID doesn't have to publish over and over again in different formats. It's aid activities. It can publish once, and it can be used to provide visualizations and information about what DFID is actually doing.
What's an example of a term of art in that Ayati language?
So the Ayati Standard is kind of like a typology that allows you to report many, many fields of data for an activity. And I think at the last check, there were hundreds of fields that you could potentially provide information on. A prime example, and something that's really important to stakeholders at the local level, would be something like subnational location. So this is where you would enter for a aid program or development program. You would enter the actual GPS coordinates of that activity, and then when all of that information is if you imagine that then within the Ayati registry, so imagine an enormous database, it allows users to come in and filter by, in that case, geographic location, but by donor, by year, by sort of commencement date of the activity or closure date of the activity. So Ayati helped with the standard, they helped to standardize the terminology that we use to describe aid activities, ergo allowing us to put the information in a format that was then comparable across multiple different types of aid organization.
Interesting. So basically the idea is that donors and other members of the development community sought to kind of streamline the kind of information that they would provide to each other and to the world in order, presumably, to like maximize the impact of their aid activities. But also, presumably, a platform like this is only as strong as the kind of number and enthusiasm in which donors and other members of the development community engage with it. Is that fair?
No, that's fair. There's a number of factors that are important to consider. You'll have just the number of organizations that are contributing to the kind of the global aid map, as it were. So obviously, if we were missing any major aid agencies providing information in that language, then that would leave a hole. Our Aid Transparency Index, which we launched last week, highlighted an example of that, which is China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't publish data in the Ayati language, although it does publish certain aid information about what it does. But because it's missing from that Ayati data set, we then have a bit of a gap there. So yeah, we want, ideally we'd have a complete tapestry of all the organizations that are providing aid funds. We would then have organizations reporting on a timely basis. So, the aspiration is that we get all major organizations publishing on a monthly basis. You would hope that organizations would be publishing quality information. So that is using the majority of the fields that are available to provide a really comprehensive overview of what their activities are, and then providing them sort of consistently and comparably, so that you can compare those against the activities of other organizations.
What aid agencies would you say are the most transparent, that use the platform perhaps most enthusiastically and
Yeah,
diligently?
so the Aid Transparency Index, which is one of our flagship research reports, we launched the latest edition. We produce it every 2 years. We launched the latest edition just last week. And this included 47 aid agencies, development finance institutions, philanthropic organizations. So we had a real mix in there. It was actually, and we rank those 47 agencies against, we use a combination of software and manual checks on tens of thousands of documents, the manual checks are, to sort of calibrate their data against 35 indicators that we have used and that we've shared with the community and consulted with the community on. And the long and the short of it is we end up with a ranking in the report. At the top of the ranking, we have those organizations that score very good and good. And at the bottom, as you can imagine, it's those who are poor and very poor. Now, at the very good end in the latest Aid Transparency Index, the majority, or there were a large number of development finance institutions who were scoring quite highly. So that would be groups like the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank and the World Bank IDA and the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, I should say that for Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, we were only able to assess their sovereign portfolios because they weren't providing data on their private portfolios. But nonetheless, those organizations scored very well across the suite of our indicators. So that's across information relating to the activity itself, information that helps you evaluate their performance and so forth. But we also had some UN agencies in the top 10. We had UNDP and UNICEF. We had some what are known as vertical funds, so Global Fund and Gavi were in there. And then in terms of bilateral agencies, we had US's Millennium Challenge Corporation, UK's Department for International Development, and Global Affairs Canada.
On the bottom end was China, which was not terribly transparent. Are there any examples of like large aid China's aid agency isn't particularly large? Are there any large donors that don't score very well on this?
So if we go through the bottom 10, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Denmark, Norway, Ireland, Saudi Arabia, we have the US Defense Department, we have the UAE, Japan, and Turkey's International Cooperation Agency. So that forms the bottom 10. So some of those are spending significant amounts of funds. I'm thinking specifically, if you think about Saudi Arabia's spend in Yemen, approximately $4 billion a year, that's a significant contribution within a certain response, let alone as a contribution to the global figures. But there are some sizable agencies in there. So there is work to be done, for sure, on getting all major aid spenders to provide this information on a regular basis and in the Ayati Standard so that we can compare. But the message that's come out of this year's the 2020 Aid Transparency Index is primarily we have more and better quality and more frequently updated data than we've ever had. But the one bit that's persistently been a challenge for the last few years is we have a significant gap in impact data. So this is data on what were the objectives of an activity, how did that activity perform against those objectives in terms of evaluations were done or impact measurements. So this is something that we as a wider community need to focus on.
I'm wondering if, since the advent of Ayati, can you draw a straight line to perhaps more efficient aid outcomes and aid delivery? If presumably if donors can see what other donors are doing, they could map their own strategies accordingly. Do you have any sort of data to back up whether or not that's actually happening, or even anecdotes to suggest that this platform is being used to more efficiently streamline aid and boost the impact of that?
So that's a great question, and it's something that I think all of us in the aid transparency community wrestle with. There's certainly the anecdotes. There's certainly the cases of how this data has been used to identify gaps in aid provision to certain countries or in certain sectors. There's examples of where this Ayati data is packaged and provided to stakeholders as a means of as a means of organizations sort of being transparent themselves. I gave the example of DFID earlier, whose systems kind of run off of this data. What we have seen recently, and something we mentioned at the launch last week, is we've seen the US's Foreign Aid Explorer tool, which they have online, which has something called the landscape tool, which allows users to identify all of the aid that's flowing into a country of interest. And this was developed it was developed by USAID, and it was developed very much at the request of mission directors who were saying, look, in order for us to develop our strategies and understand the landscape of donors and activities in which we're operating in the countries where we're based, we really have to have access to this information on a dashboard that makes it easy to understand and that we can then share with our counterparts in those other organizations. And what we've heard since then, and other tools like this have been developed, but the Foreign Aid Explorer landscape tool is one of the better examples. What we've heard since then is that now the data is really being used to A, develop strategies in country, but B, as a foundation for discussion with counterparts. And that does a couple of things. One, of course, it means we have better evidence-based decision making. But secondly, it also helps us understand in terms of feedback loops, because to date, there has been not as many users of the data as we might have hoped. And that has put us in a position where, therefore, errors in the data, simple omissions or mistakes can live for some time in the information and can cause problems for people who are using it further down the line. But now we have more people using that information. We have this feedback loop. So it's working to improve the quality of the data on a daily basis.
Kind of stepping back a little bit, presumably having access to all this information through Ayati gives you a kind of bird's eye view of global trends in aid. I'm wondering, what trends were you seeing broadly before the pandemic, and how have those trends been impacted by the pandemic?
That's a great question. I mean, we've seen recently the increase in capitalization of development finance institutions. That's one example. And we've seen this in a number of countries where those institutions, so whether you're thinking of the Development Finance Corporation in the US or the UK's own Commonwealth Development Corporation, CDC, or others throughout Europe and the world, we've seen there the use of ODA through those development finance institutions to invest in private markets and sometimes sovereign investments as well. But we've seen them definitely increasing. We've also seen ODA, official development assistance, being distributed through more and more government agencies in many countries. So rather than it just being through the traditional aid agency, we've seen in a number of countries that institutions like health departments might be working on, say, the Ebola response, for example, or other responses, and might need funding to help contribute to the response. But to give you an example, here in the UK, we have overseas development assistance currently spent by 17 government departments. So that's often a statistic that surprises people when they believe that DFID and maybe our Foreign Office are the only organisations that spend it. So. And then finally, we're seeing, as a response maybe to COVID, we're definitely seeing a kind of a rise in nationalist aid policy. We're seeing some development finance institutions being authorized to make investments on their own soil.
Really? Like what example of that? I hadn't seen that.
Corporation in the US.
Oh, yeah. Really? So this is a brand new entity created just last year. It's been financed, and now they're spending it here in the United States.
They have been authorized to. Now, Mark, I'm about to run out of intellectual rope at this point because I don't have our US team on the line. But as I understand it, authorization has been provided, given the nature of what's happening in the US and around the world, for the Development Finance Corporation to make certain investments on home soil or into institutions that are based in the US that maybe it wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, and that decision was made early on.
Interesting. So along these lines, in the UK, there was recently this proposal by the government to potentially combine DFID with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So basically, for an American audience, kind of more combining the development aid arm of the government with the diplomacy arm of the government. And I know lots of people in the development community are kind of up in arms about this because DFID has such a stellar reputation as being a particularly effective aid agency, that that might undermine its potential efficacy in the future. Do you think the kind of COVID moment is what is sort of causing or inspired the government to want to combine these two functions?
I'm not sure. I think there's been a number of discussions in the UK about what drove the government to try and or to push for this merger, and it is now going ahead. We're expecting the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to be established as of September this year. I think there's a number of reasons, arguably, why the government might have wanted to do this. Of course, on the face of it, the explanation is one of joining up diplomacy and aid for a better impact on both fronts for the UK.
I mean, earlier you mentioned DFID as being ranking very high in the Transparency Index, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from ranking very low. Are you concerned that the merger might reduce DFID's transparency?
Yes. So we are extremely nervous about the potential state of aid transparency here in the UK, and it's for a number of reasons. There is a stark difference between the transparency of DFID and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and that's exhibited by the fact that DFID are in the top 10 of our Aid Transparency Index, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are in the bottom 10. And it's an example of where the Foreign and Commonwealth Office falls down is on its impact data. It provides almost no objectives, evaluations, results for its aid spending. But it's also, another factor is that the UK government set some targets which were aspirational and I think admirable, which were that all overseas development assistance spent by the UK government, so this is approximately £15 billion as of last year, regardless of which agency it goes through, should meet the standard of good or very good in our methodology. And this has helped drive an improvement in aid transparency in the UK as the money's spread more thinly across more and more departments, some of whom have limited experience of spending overseas development assistance. Those targets are about to expire, and the government hasn't given confidence that they will be reinstated. At the same time, and I'm sure you've seen the same news that we've seen, two fundamental pieces of the scrutiny puzzle in the UK are their future is in question. Those are the Parliamentary International Development Committee, and it's not been confirmed that will continue in its current guise, and the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, which does exactly what it says. It does a series of reviews and in-depth research and analysis to hold the government accountable on various aspects of how we spend aid. It's highly respected, it's globally regarded, and it's a model that has been replicated in other countries. And those two entities have not been, the government hasn't confirmed that they will exist in a form that is acceptable to stakeholders here. So, okay, we have had commitments that our commitment to 0.7% of our gross national income aid budget will continue, which is obviously hugely important. And in the UK, here is a matter that's enshrined in law. And we have had confirmation from the government that we will continue as a nation to adhere to the OECD's Development Assistance Committee rules on overseas development assistance. Those are positive for sure, and we'd expect those to be the minimums. But in a circumstance where we don't know if we're going to continue to have our two most important and rigorous scrutiny bodies, and at a time where the government is saying that it hasn't given confidence that we will continue to have aid transparency targets here, then you can understand why we're particularly nervous. So we're pushing for the UK government to reinstate those targets. We're pushing for the UK government to continue its global leadership. You've got to remember that DFID was very much front and center at the start of the aid transparency movement as far back as 2008 and pushing for Ayati and initially funding Ayati to get off of the ground. And it needs to continue to, as a thought leader in that space, as an example to other bilateral organizations. There's only one bilateral organization that scores better on transparency than DFID, and that's the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Others still need to do a bit of catching up. And that's really our message to the government, that we need to see this commitment. We need to see confidence provided that these things will stay in place in order to make sure that UK aid continues its world-leading reputation.
And it really is worth emphasizing that it does have a world-leading reputation. I think that's in part because it seems to have support across the political spectrum in the UK. I mean, successive conservative governments have established those committees that you just described and have maintained that commitment to that 0.7 development assistance target. So it's just interesting, though. Now we're seeing seemingly a potential that those commitments may not be maintained. Well, the 0.7 commitment maintained, but the other aspects of the UK's leadership in this space not maintained, potentially through the merger of DFID and FCO.
We see these elements that I've spoken of, the scrutiny, the aid transparency targets, and then the leadership on aid transparency. We see these as the kind of the insurance policies, because it's going to be difficult, even with the best will in the world and all of the expertise, both within DFID and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, that needs to come together now to form this new institution. It's going to be difficult to avoid both. I guess it's the perception of conflicts of interest that is the concern. You know, as these two offices are brought together, there is going to be a conflict in their mandates. And while we have confidence that this will be, well managed and that there will be the checks and balances in place to ensure that there aren't any, scandals, there's always the risk of perception of scandals or conflicts of interest, and transparency is the perfect sunlight to be cast on their operations. And if we can see where the money's going at a granular level, if we can see how the procurement's being done, if we can see how the decisions are being made and the priorities are being set, then we can have confidence that that money's being spent well, which frees up this new institution to go ahead and do what it needs to do, which is take on some of the biggest development challenges in the world, especially at a time of COVID.
Well, Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for your
Mark,
time. It's very helpful. All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Gary. That was helpful and interesting. And we have some great episodes coming up in the near future, so stay tuned. All right. Stay safe, everyone. As always, reach out to me if you have questions for me or suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover. I always love hearing from you. Just hit me up using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. All right. See you next time. Bye.